I think Gary gave us a great overview of the many, many challenges that would go into fundamentally rethinking and redoing what we mean by higher education on a global basis. And there were some elements that he stressed that I think are worth re-stressing as well. And two of those elements are the element of human subjectivity and the great confusion that currently exists between the problem of subjectivity, shared subjectivity, and objectivity, which is in a sense a way of cognition that is abstracted and somewhat separated from human experience. That is something that we can certainly comment on quite importantly. And the other aspect of this is the relation of human subjectivity to a better understanding of the context within which higher education has to be done. And contextuality is still a mightily contested feature, in part because the way in which knowledge is taught and thinking skills are developed in a university, at least today, is that it's fundamentally done in a disaggregated way. In other words, there's some hope that if you go through a particular discipline, you will pick up all the thinking skills necessary for a wider range of performances in the aftermath of your education. But of course, that's a matter of just pure luck. There's no self-conscious effort to ensure that that the student does have a sense of the relevant context out of which the most important problems in science, the humanities, governance, etc., emerge, and you don't really ultimately have an adequate understanding unless you are able to do the matter of contextuality in a systematic way. And given that our approach to education is really global in scope, it's important that we understand how very important and how difficult the question is of basically teaching the relevant skills of contextuality. Now, in my paper, I avoided the problem that we initially developed about the demographics, the large-scale availability of qualified students, the lack of faculty, and the lack of space to accommodate such students in the future. I wanted to go back to some of the very fundamental issues that I think are worth putting on the table and discussing. And the first of those issues is the question of what is higher education for? Now, we can say in value terms, well, higher education is one of the most important institutions by which we generate enlightenment in every field of human endeavor. And that's correct. But it still begs the question, well, what kind of enlightenment are we talking about? And it seems to me that there are two things that should perform some element of normative guidance in the way we develop courses, organize curricula, develop degrees of skill specialization at a higher level. First is the most important human problem, I think, is the problem of human security. So that you would like to think that whatever else we do, all the courses that we generate in a higher education setting should self-reflect on the role that that course will play in the dimension of human security. So if it were in climate science, what are the issues about climate science that may well threaten the sustainability of the human population, or indeed the survivability of the human population? Now that can move from climate science into the study of international law, the law of war. Certainly in terms of human security, peace would be one of the most important issues. I don't know of many universities that self-consciously say that their overall value in terms of the contribution to our education, is the matter of universal peace and security. But it seems to me that you can't, we may do this by little bits and pieces, but we don't have a systematic way of self-reflecting on just about everything that we do and asking the question, and how does this contribute to the promotion and defense of human security? The second component of this, and these are of course interrelated, is the question of what is higher education for? Should it be reproducing at the most fundamental level the sense of the basic value of human dignity? And by human dignity, we can say today, at least tentatively, that we're really talking about all of the rights that can be conceptualized as values that now at least already exist in the International Bill of Rights. And there is some shying away from this. People are a bit frightened of this notion that maybe the central point of all of what we do is that it promotes and defends the concept of human dignity on a universal basis. And that has many, many other implications, like the universalization of empathy, the universalization of solidarity. We can't have a global human rights commitment if we cannot also aspire to the notion of the oneness of humanity and the global solidarity that is the essential foundation of all of human rights. So those are some of the values. There may be others that you can put in there, but those are the ones that I think would be of some importance. And then the specific issue that I wanted to take up in the paper was the question of the orientation, the vantage point, the notion of observation and intervention that implies that accompanies all knowledge. And here it seems to me that what we do not do now, but which I think is very important in a new future university setting, is that we have to teach the student that all of the major problems in any major field of human endeavor are problems that emerge from the eco-social context. So this already assumes that you have to have some economic method of delineating the eco-social process, because it is out of that process that all the problems emerge from economics, from science, from the humanities, from philosophy or whatever. And that eco-social process then, in my opinion, is the generator of the problems that we have to confront in higher education. And here I think one of the most important and forgotten issues is that we like to incant the lingo about problem orientation, but before we even do that, we need to figure out what the problems are, and does our model of describing the eco-social process which generates problems, does it provide us with a method of predicting problems? And there's nothing more important, I think, than the capacity to anticipate the wide range of problems to which man's intellect and technical and scientific know-how and philosophic know-how can be oriented. So that's the first thing. Now, in the context of the eco-social process, there are some vitally important subcomponents of context that are also not adequately handled today. And the most important of the outcomes of your eco-social process are going to be, in a global system, how do we accurately depict the problems of effective power? And that requires us to contextualize global power, because all of us are affected by it in some way or another, and we need to understand it, we need to predict it, and we need to reshape it, because it's global power that will ultimately tell us what we can institutionalize for peaceful and democratic purposes, and what we can achieve in terms of a form of agreed upon precepts of global governance. Then I moved from that into the notion that, again, an unsettling notion even today, many people will deny that there is such a thing as a global constitutional process. In fact, we do have a global constitution. We hardly ever talk about it, but it is the United Nations Charter, and every state that becomes a member of the Charter has to agree to the principles and values behind the UN Charter. Well, states agree, but then they agree to ignore it or undermine it in many ways. So the question of putting onto the agenda an understanding in the students of tomorrow of the dimensions of a global constitutional process, its weaknesses, its strengths, what we can do to meaningfully improve it, and so on, is another important part of that context. And then, of course, the global system deals with a multitude of systems of public order, catching, business, family relations, governance, and so on. And those issues are also a matter of context. Now, moving from that into one of the most important things that we stress with regard to teaching is we want our students to learn critical thinking skills, critical analytical skills. And that requires we are tampering with the way people think. That's what higher education is about. That's what all education is about. So we have to confront that directly. Now, the great insight into this was the book by Dewey, How We Think. And Dewey distilled essentially 5 integrated and interrelated thinking skills. The first of these skills is to think in terms of values and goals. That, in modern philosophical jargon, is normative thinking. Thinking in terms of morals, ethics, and values. Any problem implicates values and therefore requires value clarification and value exposition. It requires a distinctive form of thinking that's associated with the way morals are justified. From those thinking skills, we come to the notion that we live, if you like, all of us live on a time-space continuum, and that time-space continuum is reflected in the study of the trend or historical thinking. So historical thinking is not the same as normative thinking, but we need to understand what things happened in the past and how that might influence the present and the future. The third of these skills is the thinking in terms of conditions, or scientific thinking, thinking in terms of causes and consequences. In other words, we want to know what are the causes and consequences of the problem that we are now looking at, and do we have an adequate explanation of that in terms of science. So scientific thinking then is also integrated into this. Now you can already see the model that Dewey was putting up was to obliterate the distinction between the objective and the subjective, because traditionally people said, oh, if you describe values and morality, that's subjective, whereas science is objective. But you can see that thinking requires the exercise of all of these thinking faculties and methods. And then the fourth of these is the issue of, well, if you're trying to solve a problem, it's also a project into the future. So you need some dimension of futuristic thinking, and futuristic thinking, can't be validated purely by causes and consequences. You have to have some other way of rationally constructing a possible future from a given set of circumstances, and then ask yourself which of these futures is the desirable one, which we hope you will have been guided by the values you've clarified. So futuristic thinking then is another important skill. And finally, there is the one skill that we say a lot about, but we don't really do it. Sometimes we even discourage it, and that's creative thinking. Creative thinking. And by creative thinking, well, there are lots of different ways of doing this, but if you have, in terms of this sense, a desired future and also a picture of the one that is undesirable, then your creative challenge will be, how do we get to the preferred one and avoid the worst case scenario? So alternative thinking then is another important and a matter that should be explicitly a component of a future curriculum. I added a sixth issue, and that was, I thought that the issue of problem identification and the social process context from which it emerges is another distinctive skill. People may differ with me on that, but I would add that to it, because if you don't know what the problem is, then you can't perform the kind of thinking skills that you need. So the ability to perceive the problem, to contextualize it, to understand how the problem relates to other problems, to understand how the problem splits itself up in a multitude of sub-problems and so on. Those are the things that I was talking about. Now I wanted to move from those thinking skills to the other component of higher education that I think we lack, and that is every human being evolves into a process by which the human being makes decisions. So decision-making is innate in human experience, right from the time that you teach the child to use the potty, because if you don't use the potty, the consequences are quite unpleasant. You know? That requires the child to develop some intelligence. You need to promote the notion of going to the toilet. You need to basically have a family rule that prescribes, look, when you feel you need to go to the John, you sit on the John and you wipe the backside, and so on. And so what we have here is something that is just not well understood. It's not my work. This comes from fellows of the Academy, Harold Laszlo, Miles McDougall, Michael Riesman, Richard Falk, and so on. But what we think is so vitally important is that if you understand the problems, if you go through the tools that will help you solve the problems, you still have to operationalize the solution in terms of decision-making at any level. But we do little to teach the students about decision-making. So very briefly, you'll see there are 7 interrelated, if you like, that's the architecture of decision-making: the intelligence, the promotion, the prescription, the invocation to the particular problem, the specific application, determination, and the appraisal of what you do. So it seems to me that decision-making is ubiquitous in just about every field of higher education endeavor, and we should be able to integrate components of this into the many different areas of human endeavor at the higher education level. And we go on to the next, to conclude briefly, I mentioned the values. From the International Bill of Rights, and by that I mean the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights, and a whole host of others, including the rights of the child, prohibition of slavery, rights of women, and so on. What we emerge with is that these, descriptively, the global social process, in fact, involves essentially 9 values. 9 values, okay? And this is only descriptively. And descriptively, we mean there would be power, and there's an institutionalization of power. So each value refers to a major human institution, nationally, locally, globally. So we can see power. Well, we'd start out with, well, power is a complicated thing to describe in the international system. We have an international institution, the UNO, but the UNO really doesn't wield major power. And so we have to unpack the problem of power even within the UN with the P5 and others. Finally, the conclusion is simply, I agree with Gary, we have to be contextual, we need to be problem-oriented, multi-method, interdisciplinary, and we cannot have a future of higher education that is value-free. Thanks.